Okay, guys, so welcome to the States, Markets, and People in the Contemporary Middle East. Some of you actually they know me, but I'm Shaima Khattab. I'm teaching Middle East and basically Latin American and Middle Eastern politics at the India Institute. So I'm teaching at the Global Affairs Masters. I'm not sure, have you managed to go through the handbook on Keats? Yeah, okay, so you know like the topics you are going to cover, and yeah, I'll go like quickly through the assessment and pattern and the main themes you are going to cover throughout the semester. So basically the whole point, we are going to cover like a broad range of can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So a broad range or a wide range of themes that actually investigate the political and economic and social developments in the MENA region, and the whole point is to learn or to train you in linking recent events or contemporary events and linking this back to the historical, or digging out the historical roots of some recent events in order to fathom or to develop thorough understanding and develop thorough explanation of or plausible explanation of these events. And part of the module as well, so we need to grapple with the complexity of the region and to revise and to critically think about the sweeping generalization about the region. And this will happen, and this actually, we're going to tackle this through highlighting different theoretical perspectives and investigating some case analysis to understand how how particular theory would be applicable to one case, but it's not the case for other country. And yeah, like other modules, you need to learn how to synthesize materials and how to synthesize different theoretical approaches or different conceptual frameworks and apply this and apply them to socio-political phenomena in the Middle East. So this is how we are, like this week, we are going to tackle like colonial policies and colonialism and the global market. So basically the module is divided into four main parts. The first one, we are going to tackle the colonial period as a political project and the colonial authority and how it affected the processes of development and state formation in the Middle East. And then we are going to move to like the role of the state in development, and we are going to start out with the state capitalism and how the colonial elites managed to embark on extensive developmental project and what's called import substitution industrialization strategy, and then how this affected, the development records in the region, and how the state made the shift from import substitution or state-led development model to neoliberal economies or neoliberal policies, and how this affected the social composition, the social structure, and the composition of the elite circle. And then we are going to zoom in on two particular aspects of neoliberal economies, mainly trade policies and capital market in the Middle East. And we are going to highlight like the prototypical cases in these themes in the lecture and in the seminar. And then we are going to pivot the focus towards, the people's livelihoods and like the conception of human security. And we are going to investigate like sectarianism and identity politics and how sectarian and ethnic divisions would affect, the people's livelihoods and the development of modern nation state. And then migration and refugees, gender norms and politics, climate change and food security. And then we'll touch upon the Arab uprising and bring together different threads by highlighting non-state actors, not only political, but also economic sovereign wealth funds and non-state actors, and the role of the United States in the region, and how these kind of geopolitical calculations affected state-society relations and actually enable the state to reproduce its power and overpower social actors. For the assessment, you have you're going to submit a reaction paper next month. So basically, you're going to reflect critically on the core readings we're going to discuss in the seminar. And this is like the week for neoliberal economies and the changing composition of class structure, or the social relations after in the post-neoliberal period. And then you have your final essay, it's due on 24th of April, and you have a list of the questions in the module handbook, so you can find them on Keats. Any questions so far? Okay, so this is like the layout of the lecture. We are going to firstly, I'm going to give like a brief overview of the MENA integration into the global market, and how actually different forms of integration into, or different forms actually of colonialism is started even long before the 20th century, before the materialization of the colonial authority as a political project. And we're going to highlight commercial and financial aspects here. And then to what extent colonial policies affected or brought about different development trajectories in the region. We're going to cast or to shed light on two main theoretical frameworks. One of them developed by James Mahoney. He actually links, the level of colonization with the consequences or the long-term effect of the level of colonization on the development of economic institutions, or the long-term effect of colonialism on development records. He actually applied this to Spanish America, and it applied to the 16th century colonization. So we are going to investigate to what extent this would be applicable, or it will fare well when it comes to the Middle Eastern cases. And then the dependency theory, and we bring in the role of the external factors and to what extent this interplay between endogenous and exogenous factors would help us understand underdevelopment records or dependent development trajectory in the Middle East. We are going to investigate Egypt, that used to be a model case for colonial development, and then we're going to develop some sort of critical account of this and investigate to what extent colonial policies resulted in varieties of development trajectories. That it actually it actually led to some sort of underdevelopment in some countries, basically in Palestine and Iraq, and we're going to investigate this further in the seminar session today. Have you managed to do the core readings? So any clue on how like the Middle East region got, or what had been part of the global economy before the 20th century? Any clue on commercial and financial ties of the Middle Eastern region and European states through trade? Yeah. What else? Yeah, this is actually true. Like, it didn't start with the installation of the colonial authority as a political project. It started like way back before the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and the division of the region between the global powers, mainly the UK and France. So basically, part of the region had been tied or had been part of the global economy through these kind of commercial ties. So any clue about like the terms of trade ties during the Ottoman rule? So to what kind of commercial ties the region had with the European states during the Ottoman Empire, during or under the Ottoman Empire rule? Yeah. So it was basically through like the sales of the European manufactured goods in exchange for primary goods or raw materials, coming from parts of the Ottoman Empire, right? So, with the exception of like silk and cotton exports in the Levant, so the whole region had been dependent on imports from Europe, and few exports, came out of the region to the European regions. So it was kind of dependent commercial ties between parts of the Ottoman Empire and the European countries. And it became worse, in the 16th century through a series of agreement. European merchants, were given some sort of economic concessions to trade. It's called the capitulations. So they were allowed to trade freely in the within the Ottoman extensive territories and Ottoman ports, and like in terms of what kind of concessions they had, like tax exemption. They had their own separate way of jurisdiction, so they had their own courts in order to resolve any kind of economic disputes. So they had, these kind of economic concessions that actually affected the domestic industries or the domestic merchants, that they were unable, to cope with the fierce competition that came from the European traders. So it was like one form of, or one aspect of colonialism. It was like, these kind of dependent commercial ties or unequal exchanges between different parts of the Ottoman Empire and the European countries. And then, like some countries, basically Turkey, Istanbul, and Cairo, they tried to embark on an ambitious modernization project, and they had to that actually put them into fiscal troubles, and they had to borrow money from the European countries, and this actually led to another form of colonialism, which was financial dependency. Because of these kind of bankruptcy, so these countries, they had, to borrow some loans, from the European countries, basically the England and France, and this actually put them into financial trouble and gave space for these European countries to intervene into their internal affairs by hiring some sort of economic advisors in in the cabinet, basically in Egypt. And this led to, like, this limited, the autonomy of the ruling class to allocate resources or to accumulate surpluses to channel, or to funnel these monies or resources into social programs or any kind of productive or industrial projects. So this is another aspect or another form of colonialism, which was emanated from this financial dependency. And in addition to these commercial and financial aspects, it came, these kind of materialization of the political, of the colonial project as a political authority after the dismembering of the Ottoman Empire, and how, like, Britain and France divided up the region by giving them, like, authority of protectorate or mandate or even settlement in Algeria and Palestine. So the whole point here, like, even before, this kind of political aspect of colonial power, they used, like, economic technique or development discourse in order to exercise some sort of political power or to bring some parts or the whole region under their authority. And you have, like, Egypt as like typical case, of this discourse of development and how this discourse of or using economic tools or financial aspects in order to exercise political power. So we have here Lord Cromer, like yeah, what happened in Egypt. Anyone like anyone knows what happened in Egypt before, like, in 1882? Yeah, but I mean, in relation to the European, yeah, it was like it had like autonomous status in relation to the Ottoman Empire. But what happened exactly in relation to well, this kind of financial dependency or the financial aspect of colonialism? Because of these kind of excessive, borrowing from the European power, so they had, to intervene in order to monitor the debt. It became heavily indebted, so that's why they became interested in the allocation of the resources and the exercised power over the allocation of financial resources in order to make sure of the debt service payment. So that's why Britain intervened in order to quell the national revolt or the national uprising of Arabi that asked for fiscal autonomy of Egypt from Britain or from external powers, mainly the France and the UK, that they had like some sort of physical authority or they exercised political authority over the ruling class. So the High Commissioner there at the time, he made, like Lord Cromer, they made, this statement. In the absence of ties, such a community of race, language, religion, and social customs, the only link between the governor and the governed is to be found in material interest. And amongst those interests, by far the most important is the imposition of a light fiscal burden and employment of European capital to accelerate a program of economic development in Egypt. Any reflection on this quote? So how they used, this kind of fiscal authority or economic tools to as a technique to exercise political power over Khidewi at the time. So I need your critical thought on this. So to what extent this reflects, like this quotation actually reflects, this kind of colonial authority?
Social and government. There is no correlation between the governors and the governed people in terms of social flow. They're just being governed by the governors and that's all.
No, there is no, like, these kind of social ties between Egyptians, governed and governors, and the British authority. So they had like to base it on material interests. So this is how like they use, these kind of economic aspects or physical aspect to as a technique to exercise power or to legitimize their tutelage, power over the governor, that actually they were not like rational enough, that they borrowed a lot, like they put their country into fiscal trouble. So that's why the British authority, they actually intervened in order to supervise or to monitor, the allocation of the resources. And actually the governors as well, they were unable, to govern themselves, rendering again like this kind of political tutelage, necessary for to impose some sort of light physical burden. So they know well how to allocate the resources efficiently. They know well how to modernize the irrigation system, how to modernize the agricultural sector. This is what happened, by the way. They developed a program called it land reclamation. So they liquidated, the debt, and they mortgage, the land to different landowners at low prices, and they invited, some like financial joint stock companies, registered on the stock market in Egypt to come in, and this led to influx of credit in order to mortgage land and to allow to give credit to give people access to credit in order to buy lands and to transform Egypt into a giant cotton plantation. So they did know well how to allocate resources efficiently. So they know well how to make the agricultural sector function efficiently and to have some sort of transformative aspect that would lead Egypt towards the development path. And this is actually the materialized or implemented this program. So this is the economic aspect of how they used, this economic aspect or fiscal aspect of colonial authority in order to exercise power over the rulers and the ruled as well. But do you think, like, the question of development or underdevelopment or these kind of market transactions are reducible only to these kind of exchanges like allocation of resources, channeling, money, inviting financial companies or financial banks to install themselves in Egypt? So did it have only these kind of economic and physical aspects, or like these kind of market transactions, they had like different scope, or they had different aspects as well? Mainly like ecological, social, and political. So political, we talked about, like they used this to legitimize their the exercise of power over the governor and the governed in Egypt. So, like, this is what the critical, like, political economists would say. Like, it's not only reducible to these kind of material exchanges of goods or allocation of material or financial resources. It had some sort of embeddedness of market relations or market exchanges into social relations and into ecological relations as well. So basically, it had like some sort of ecological aspect, because what happened, they made use of the cheap nature, they made use of the land, and they exhausted, by transforming this into like giant, by increasing, the productivity of land and make this to cultivate, large parts of the land, and in order just to serve the interest of the British industries, because they use, this cotton as a raw material to be imported in order to benefit the manufacturing sector in Britain. So this led to the exploitation of the natural resources in Egypt, and by allowing or selling lands at low prices, this led to the state didn't have any sort of authority over surpluses. They don't have they don't accumulate surpluses in order to use this to fund some sort of social programs like healthcare programs, or to spend money on on education. So that's why the state didn't have any kind of autonomy to accumulate surpluses and use these surpluses for industrial transformation or in increasing expenditure on social programs, and both are necessary for sustainable or transformative development projects. And it led to some sort of institutional corrosion as well, because the massive influx of financial companies or joint stock companies, it actually led to small farmers in fiscal troubles, because they had to get some sort of, they exhausted the lands first of all, and not everyone had access to this credit, and it led to physical trouble at the end of the day, because they don't have the decreasing crop yields, decreasing the productivity of lands, so they were unable to pay back the debt, and it affected their livelihoods, and it led to the shutting down or closing these kind of financial institutions. And they had it led to capital flight, at some point as well. So in order to understand to what extent this kind of different forms of colonial relationships, economic, physical, commercial, or political, had impact on development trajectories. So we have like two main theoretical, we have so many, like we're going to discuss two main theoretical frameworks in order to understand different trajectories, or to what extent colonial economic policies that with the embeddedness of market into ecological and social and political aspects affected long-term trajectory of development in the region. So we have like James Mahoney framework and dependency theory, and we focus from like one offshoot developed by Peter Evans, and this is what we are going to apply to the case of Egypt. So here, what James Mahoney said about like Spanish colonial power in South America. So the main argument is the level of colonization affected the long-term development in South American region. So how? Like the heavy presence or the heavy existence of colonial authority in some countries, like establishing some sort of institutions or settlements, it affected, developed some sort of entrepreneurial spirit and development of international competitive advantage. And these countries managed to make their own way, or to carve out their own path in the global market or the international economy. So first of all, what would account for the heavy presence or the level of colonialism in the region? So first of all, this accumulation orientation, like he mentioned like two main orientations here, mercantilist or liberal. So mercantilist economies, so they don't care about promoting self-sufficiency and promoting some sort of short-term consumerism. On the contrary, liberal way or liberal orientation of accumulation, they actually give priority to promoting international competitiveness advantage and long-term investment and innovation and economic upgrading. So this is kind of like, if you have like, different patterns of accumulation orientation, this and state regulation as well, like if you are mercantilist mentality or orientation, so they don't care about the strong or the heavy presence of or the heavy role of the state in the economy by imposing restrictions on trade transactions, investment priorities, and private ownership. And liberals, they don't have, they prefer, not heavy presence of the state in the economy, so they don't care about lifting restrictions on trade transactions and private property. And pre-existing political economy, these are like the three main aspects that actually affected the level of colonialism in Latin America. So the orientation, the accumulation orientation of the colonizer, like the Spanish authority, the state regulation, and pre-existing political and economic institutions in the colonized. So basically, and he distinguished between higher complexity and lower complexity. So if the country politically like complex, so they have like, centralized bureaucratic authority. Economically, they have like clear division of labor and extensive extensive slavery and extensive agricultural economic activities. And they have like this broad class alliances that like governed, that was like pre-state formation that govern, these kind of political entities. And they have like countries with low level of complexity, meaning they have like decentralized bureaucratic apparatuses, they don't have clear division of labor, and they have like only one one ethnic group or one kinship that actually govern the political entities. So these factors affected the calculations about like the startup cost, whether or not, because if I need to establish my own institutions as my own economic institutions as a colonizer, so I have to calculate the cost, the startup cost. If there are like, heavy presence of the state, pre-existing complex apparatuses, politically, economically, so I might face like a fierce resistance from regional authorities or different broad-based, coalition or class alliances in the region. So there will be like high startup cost, and whether or not I require to introduce a new pattern of authority. So I have this kind of mercantilist, accumulation orientation. So I prefer. I'd rather work within the existing political institutions, because I need like strong presence of the state in order to put restrictions, to put some sort of protective restrictions in order to ensure self-sufficiency and short-term consumerism. On the contrary, if I'm a liberal, so it will be like I cannot like afford the cost in order to dismantle the existing institutions, but with the lower complexity in countries with lower complexities, I can establish my own institutions that would affect the long-term investment decisions and development of entrepreneurial spirit. And this is what happened, with the, so you see here, like mercantilist and higher complexity, so this higher level of colonization. So, and you know why, right? So they need some sort of institution, pre-existing institutional setting to work within, instead of establishing this from scratch. For the liberal, if they have in order to settle or to colonize countries with higher complexities, so they prefer, to have lower level of colonization. They don't establish their own institutions. By the same token, the liberals in lower complexity context, so they establish, their own institutions, so they have higher level of colonialism in order to develop, this kind of long-term investment plan. And mercantilists, they have lower level, lower presence, in lower complexity context. Okay. How this affected, the whole argument is how this affected, these kind of colonial setting or the level of colonialism affected post-colonial development trajectory. So what Mahoney mentioned, they had this kind of great reversal. The countries that they have this kind of mercantilist accumulation orientation, and they have heavy presence of colonizer, so they were unable to develop, to have good record of development in the post-colonial period. And on the contrary, the liberals that they established, their own, they established kind of institutions in the colonized countries. They managed these kind of colonized countries after independence. They managed, to develop, to make some sort of good records in economic progress and economic growth. Any guess, how this happened and why? This kind of reversed fortune, or the reverse track. Yeah, because mercantilists, colonial institutions, and they work within, the institutional configuration. So they have some sort of extensive class of land oligarchy that actually pushed back against any form of any kind of economic reform that would affect their monopolistic or their control over slaves or over agricultural sector. And these kind of landed or oligarchy, they had their rational, regional alliances that actually pushed back against any kind of centralization of the authority, because they need, some sort of decentralization in order to have full control over lands and over their agricultural slaves or coerced labor. And then they have like they form powerful coalition in order to resist any form of any development of market actors or entrepreneurs that would affect actually their interest in slavery, agriculture, or in agricultural sector. So they actually resisted any kind of centralization of the authority. They resisted the installation of any kind of institutions that would impact or affect investment decisions or the development of international competitiveness advantage in these countries. On the opposite, you have like this liberal colonial institutions. So they had already liberals, they installed some sort of liberal institutions. So in the post-independence state in Latin America, they managed, to work within or to rework these institutions into development plans in order to have these kind of institutional transformation. They don't have landed oligarchy. They don't have any kind of regional blocks to push back against centralization of power. They don't have like slavery or agricultural, slave-based agricultural sector. So that's why they managed, to rework, the existing institutions established by the colonizer in order to make investment decisions and to develop competitive advantage in the global market. So this obviously applied to Latin America and the 16th century colonialism. To what extent this would be applicable reasonably or plausibly in the Middle East. So starting out with the level of colonization and the calculations about making, their own decisions about settling into particular countries and establishing new institutions or working within the institutional arrangements. To what extent this would be applicable in the region? Any clue? Okay, so I'll start out with like the high complexity and institutional building. So Egypt was like a high complex society, right? They had their own centralized authority. So it was agricultural based economy, and they have their own complex social and economic and political relations. And Britain, in this setting, according to Mahoney, British authority wouldn't have established any kind of liberal institutions that would affect or incentive or incentives, for investors to develop competitive international competitive advantage or long-term investment decision, right? But actually, the opposite. It was like the opposite way around. What happened, actually, they developed, this land reclamation program, and they invited financial companies to come in, and they established, some sort of joint stock companies, and some that led to massive influx of credit and offer access to credit to. They created actually a broad class of national landowners, and they changed the composition of the social structure in Egypt. Okay. For the lower complexity and colonial settlement, in these countries that they had colonial settlement, Palestine, Libya, and Algeria. So the colonial authorities came in and they settled and they established their own institutions, but actually it didn't have this kind of post-colonial impact Mahoney talked about. Because supposedly these countries should have experienced high level of economic progress or economic growth after the departure of colonizers, right? But what happened was quite the opposite, okay? Because of we have different reasons, why we are going to discuss this in the seminar, why colonial settlement actually and the establishment of colonial institutions didn't lead to positive impact in the post-colonial period or in the post-independence period. And then the lower complexity, and Britain in Iraq, for example, they have these kind of lower complexity. They have in tribal-based society, and they don't have extensive centralized authority, and they were unable to settle in, and they choose to rule indirectly through tribes. And actually this affected the terms of land ownership, and this affected actually the post-colonial the quality or the capacity of the bureaucratic apparatus in the post-independence period. So actually, this didn't the framework about the level of colonization and the post-colonial development. It didn't it's not quite applicable in the Middle East, and this is actually for different reasons. Like colonial settlement led to the negative impact, on the economic record, the economic development record in the post-independence period, and it actually the establishment of economic institutions. We need to and to what extent this actually affected the development as it happened in Egypt, for example. So we need to investigate this further, and we need to look deeper into this in order to understand what development means and to what extent colonial authority or the establishment of colonial institutions had an important impact on development policy formulation in the region. We are going to discuss Egypt now and further in the seminar, Palestine in the seminar, and Iraq as well in the seminar. But quickly, what happened in Palestine was the colonial settlement for the part of the Zionist and the British Authority. It led to the land expropriation, and so large scale of land purchases in the 1920s and 1930s. It affected the post-colonial development trajectory. In Algeria, France as well confiscated large tracts of arable lands, and this actually created a class of wealthy businessmen and landowners among the settlers, and they excluded natives or indigenous population from the ownership. And although they actually allocated or they offered some sort of education to Algerians, and they created some sort of some sort of elitist class that led the national liberation. It was part of the national liberation struggle, but that was not enough in order to lead the country after the departure of the French. They didn't get the training, in technical and managerial practices in order to run, the administrative affairs of the country after independence, let alone to formulate development policy, development economic policies. And in Iraq as well, this led to the changes in the land tenure terms and the erosion of the tribal power, and this affected, the balance of power between different social forces, and it led to a fierce struggle for power between different parts in Iraq. It actually it continued through the late 60s, almost 30 years after the independence from the British Authority in 1933, and actually it managed to stabilize, the political and social, and to militarize stabilization in terms of establishing, totalitarian authority or totalitarian power over society. It happened in the late 60s, in 1996. Okay. When the Ba'ath Party managed to dominate politically and to militarize, the entire society. Okay, so different dynamics happened in the Middle East that actually we need to investigate what development means and to what extent colonial policies interacted with the post-colonial. This is what we're going to see in week 3, how post-colonial elites actually exercised their own power, or they had their own agency in order to formulate development policies that actually eradicated, built on, but eradicated the heritage of the colonial power. So dependency theory, I assume that everyone knows this. Any take on the main assumption of it? Okay, so basically it turned the focus away from this simplistic notion about the impossibility of capitalist development in non-advanced countries. The proponents of this theory, they assume that developing countries, they can develop their own path, their own capitalist path, but we need to bring in we need to bring the external factor or the enduring structure of international economy back into the analysis in order to understand the positionality of these developing countries in the global or in the world system. So we need to understand, this kind of interaction between external factors and how external factors or this kind of dependent status between the core and the periphery affect the development trajectories in developing nations. So the main assumptions are this kind of clear division between the international or the international economic structure is divided between the core and the periphery, and it's based on unequal exchanges. Like the periphery would offer, this kind of cheap labor and raw materials, and the core would offer, this high cost manufactured or consumer goods. Okay, and the whole relationship is based on expropriation and exploitation. So you have like different strands and different streams in this tradition. For example, like Frank, he did spell out, how external factors affected underdevelopment in Latin America. So pattern of land ownership and exportation of raw materials, it affected the import substitution industrialization strategy in Latin America in the 50s and 60s. And that's why Latin American countries were unable, because of this legacy of dependent relationship, was unable, to have like their own autonomous path of capitalist development. Samir Amin, he had like some sort of Marxist thrust, like he called for he took the analysis of this kind of proletariat revolution to the international level. Like this kind of unequal exchanges between the core and the periphery would eventually lead to by like the periphery would offer this kind of cheap labor, and the advanced capitalist countries, they offered these kind of industrial projects or industrial products. This actually would lead to proletariat revolution in the periphery in order to rectify or to improve their dependent position in the international economic system. So Peter Evans, he offered some sort of reasonable framework in order to understand how imperialism remains the frame of analysis of dependent development. In order to understand this, how like the economies of developing countries dependent on the core, you need to investigate, four main aspects: the transnational actors, processes of interaction between domestic players and international players, and the leverage of domestic class in relation to international multinational corporations or international business community, and to what extent the state is autonomous enough in order to allocate resources or to accumulate surpluses. So first of all, like for transnational actors, you need to understand the intensity of the trade level and what kind of products are subject to trade, like primary products or in manufactured goods. The processes of the interaction between the local bourgeoisie and transnational actors, and to what extent they have like kind of leverage or negotiable, like high negotiable position in relation to transnational actors, and what part of the domestic enterprises are owned by foreign business groups or foreign people. And then you need to understand the degree of power and autonomy of the domestic class in relations to the core, and to what extent they have some authority to ask for transfer of technology, getting access to they have their own terms in order to allocate resources and to allocate labor as well. And then the state, to what extent the state is autonomous enough to promote industrialization strategy and to have like some sort of relationship with the dominant class. For example, in Egypt, the state were unable to impose protective tariffs on imports because of the landowners, they had their own interest in order to make sure that the cotton will go to the manufactured projects in the metropolitan for British industries, and this affected actually the revenues of the state. It should have accumulated in order to transfer later for social welfare programs or for industrial transformation projects. And then relationship with transnational capital, whether or not the autonomous or subservient, to these transnational capital. And this is actually what happened exactly in Egypt. They didn't have, the state didn't have autonomous position. The domestic bourgeoisie, they developed their own interest with international capital or British capital that actually affected, the national interest or the development of endogenize industry or to develop their own path of national industrial projects. And this is actually to keep, this kind of framework, Egypt as a supplier of the raw material of cotton to the metropolitan industries, to the Yorkshire and Manchester in Britain. And this actually led to, this is what we're going to discuss in the seminar, this led to a movement of economic nationalism and cooperative movement. So that's why some segment of the landowner class or the nationalist movement, they developed their own discourse to endogenize industry or to have their own economic nationalism by establishing Bank Misr, like Egypt Bank, like Talat Harb, and this is what we are going to discuss in the seminar, how this dependent form of development led to resistance or led to a counter movement that asked for economic nationalism and access to credit. So Egypt is has been depicted as a case of a successful case of development, and this is what we try to interrogate critically. And then the whole point, colonial policies brought about different development trajectories, and we're going to see what happened in Iraq and Palestine in the seminar. So it might have degenerative outcome as well, and we need to pay attention to this. So in order to understand the development project in relation to colonial authorities, so it's not a historical process, so you need to bring in conditions, ecological and social conditions as well, and the consequences of social transformation and class struggle on how autonomous the state or the domestic bourgeoisie, they have autonomous position in order to formulate economic development and economic policies. Okay, any question? Okay, so in the seminar, we continue discussing Egypt, highlighting what happened in Iraq and Palestine as well. So see you at 1. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, good.
Yes, I just wanted to ask because I saw that the first assessment is due on the 6th of February, right?
Yeah.
So is it possible that maybe next week or that you can talk about it? Because it's...
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Next week, yeah.
Right.
We will have just to go out.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. And then I can talk to you.